Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What is True. Today is the 18th day of December 2023, and I'm going to be reading from a book from Alvin Kuhn, Kuhn. The name of the book is The Shadow of the Third Century. The chapter is chapter 5. The title of the chapter is Wisdom in a Mystery. So I hope that all are doing well today. Um, So we're going to get into this book here. I've been spending a lot of time with another particular books I've been reading from Renee Schroller. But today I'm going to be reading from a gentleman that has had a great impact, Mr. Kuhn, who had his teacher, I think, or not maybe his teacher, but one who actually had an influence upon him also. So let's get into the book. Wisdom in a Mystery. The next text is to establish the fact that the allegorical method was in practically universal vogue throughout the ancient days, and that the first and most rational thinkers in the Christian movement were entirely committed to the representation and interpretation of spiritual and scriptural truth through the medium of allegory. The ancient sages composed the scriptures as allegories, and the highest Christian intelligence accepted and expounded them as such. Gibbon asserts that both Origen and Augustine were among the allegorists. He could have added Potenius and Clement, indeed the whole Alexandria school, that is. Uh, Gwen, Gwenberg's work of splendid scholarship, that is, Christianity Past and Present, will yield much material in later sections. On page 148, he states that interest into the early church was complicated through the tendency to elaborate the ritual which developed as soon as a religion begins to be systematically propagated by a true clerical class. Quote, we must take into account, he says, end quote. And then another quote here, the fear of the unsound brother who might misuse the mystery if he were admitted to it without due formalities. Precautions are accordingly taken to avoid this profanation. End quote. Yes, definitely, indeed. You were not allowed in the church or whatever I call the whole mystery teachings here. You were not allowed to just come in and do whatever you want to do. You were gradually wedded in some ways before you even were trusted. And in that point, simply, you were still, you know, you had to be worth your call. You had to be what you said you were, you see. But after showing that the mystery rests so much importance, he commits the inconsistency of saying that the arcana of the mysteries amount to little or nothing. Why then should even the ignorant Christians have taken so much precaution to avoid its profanation? But it is true enough that the mystery importance dwindle along with its with the meaning as the wave of ignorance flooded rapidly over the early movement. From the Orpheus of G.R.S. Mead, we draw a statement that fixes the fact of the wide prevalence of the esoteric method in religion, with the adjuncts of the training in the interpretation of the myths, symbols, and allegories in page 24. Quote, the perfection of highest virtue and the opening of the real spiritual senses constitute the highest degree of the mysteries. Another and most important part of the discipline was the training in the interpretation of myth, symbol, and allegory, the letters of the mystical language in which the secrets of nature and the soul were written, so plainly for the initiative, so obscurely for the general. Without these instructions, the mythical recitals and legends were unintelligible. So they wanted to make sure that someone, if there was someone coming in, they would be, they would offer the generalization of the scriptures instead of basically the allegorical of the symbols of it and the myths to protect, because they didn't want someone going around and claiming that he had some kind of truth when he didn't really have the whole truth. You see, he'd be out giving it out, and hey, this is such and such, da da da, and then what it would do is simply would cause issues. So there was, you had uh, there was a short leash on people of that nature at that time, and I don't blame them. We have quoted Sir Gilbert Murray as saying the Greek religion was bound in with a quote a romantic, trivial, and yet very edifying mythology end quote. No one can miss the fact that Greek religion was deeply grounded in mythology, but once more must be registered the pitiable confession of modern savants that the Greek myths had been too much for them. Be it said with the utmost positivism that these marvelous myths are the products not of infantile groping, but of consummated dramatic genius, and the mind that holds them to be trivial has simply never been awakened to the hidden purport of these constructions, to see the wonder world of glowing beauty therein. This negative note from Murray is all the most difficult to comprehend because in another passage he speaks of the quote the widespread and almost incredible error of treating Homer as primitive end quote. Why this gap in rating between the myths and Homer? The Iliad and the Odyssey can fairly be claimed to belong to the myths or to the mythical period and instinct, and surely he did not rate these greatest of epics as trivial. What Higgins what Higgins has found about the Homerian poems is worth noting. In the Anacalipsis, in page 542, he quotes here: "The poems of Homer I consider to have been originally sacred Asiatic songs of poems adopted by the Greeks, and that perhaps many generations they were unwritten. A school history says that they were held in the memory of the Greeks for 500 years before being written down, and as they related to the cyclical mythos, they would in the principal part suit every cycle. They were like the plays of Aeschylus, such as Epic, but all combining to form the history of the cycles to those who were initiated." End quote. Returning to Mac Chiriou work from Orpheus to Paul, there is found a assertion of the plain fact which must be hammered home to the intelligence of modern scoffers at the status and influence of the ancient mysteries. It shows that these brotherhoods and disciplines they enforced stood at the peak of culture in the ancient world. To have reached the highest degrees was the certification of the topmost refinement and spiritual unfoldment, says he in page 203. Quote, "Nothing was more usual or honorable for a man of the cultural class in Hellenic times than to become acquainted with the mysteries. In the Hellenistic age, religion as well as literature show the deep influence of the mysteries." End quote. And he shows how the stream of refinement would have touched the mind of St. Paul. Quote, "Nothing is more reasonable than to think that a cultural man like Paul, born in a great center of culture, gifted with a peculiar intelligent grasp and a vivid curiosity about religious experience, should feel attracted to Orpheus." End quote. It will be refreshing as a new baptism in the waters of truth, long neglected, ignorant, ignored, repressed for the world of modern Christianism, to face the fine truth about these mysteries, penned not by a hostile mind, but by one of the most highly accredited of Christian historians, the English scholar von Moschem, that's spelled Mosheim, in his great two-volume work on the history of Christian religion, covering the first 3¼ centuries. He writes of the pagan mysteries, volume 1, page 18, quote, "None were admitted to behold or partake in the celebration of these mysteries, but those who have approved themselves worthy of such distinction by their fidelity and perseverance in the practice of a long and severe course of initiated forms. The Votariats were enjoined under the peril of immediate death to observe the most profound secrecy as to everything that passed, and this sufficiently account for the difficulty that we find in obtaining any information respecting the nature of those recluse practices and for the discordant and contradictory opinions concerning them that are to be met with in the writings of various authors, ancient as well as modern." End quote. Here's the rebuke to many a quibbling snare of Christian scholarship at the pagan mysteries. He continues by assuming in the dare of positive record that perhaps, quote, in those brotherhoods, some things were done in the highest degree repugnant to virtue, modesty, and every fine feeling, end quote. But, quote, it is probable that in those of the most, sorry, of those of a more refined cast, same some advance was made in bringing religion back to the test of reason, by inquiring into and exposing the origin and absurdities of the popular superstitions and worship. There might, therefore, be some foundation for the promise usually held for to those who were about to be initiated, that they would be put in possession of the means of rendering this life happy, and also for the expectation open to them of entering upon an improved state of existence hereafter. However, this might be it. However, this might be. It is certain that the highest veneration was entertained by the people of every country for what was termed the mysteries, and the Christians, perceiving this, were induced to make their religion conform in many respects to this part of the heathen model, hoping that it might thereby more readily attain a favorable reception with those whom it was their object and their hope to convert. End quote. These lines have stood in print in a highly respected and accredited work by a Christian protagonist for a century or more of the modern age, but in open defiance of their forthright and truthful assertion as to the high character and reputable status of the ancient mystery brotherhoods. Christian writers have gone on in a dismal drone of reprobation and denunciation of these institutions in book after book. It is all too evident, but part and parcel of that inevitable disposition to be besmirch which one taint or another everything pagan or pre-Christian, a deposition which the more is encountered in reading Christian literature, the more clearly it is seen in a true light as a base of sheer disease of the Christian mind, when the spokesman for a religion that by his own claim incudious love and charity plus forbearance of one's enemies must endlessly vent the spleen of sheer jealousy over every laudable thing connected with a rival, till even a rival's clear virtues must be made to appear as sins. One has before the eyes the certain marks of what is named bigotry and pusillanimity. It is doubtful if even the cautious Bonnet statement of von Mosheim is quite true and just in every particular. He too must not lose the chance to throw in almost a aside his emanated version that charges the mysteries cults with gross immortality. This is not this time or place to take up the controversy over the comparable immortal character of pagan versus Christian rites and conducts, but it is a little short of certain that, as in the case of the rituals, that is in the Buddhist and the Hindu ceremonies, which employ phallic symbols and sex symbolism with high and pure mystical significance, certain items and appertainments of the mystery situated have been grossly misconceived and misconstrued. The actions of unworthy participants can debase the purest ceremonial. No brief need be held for the stainless purity of the mystery cults. With a fair court to hear all the evidence, a privilege which has hardly ever been accorded the case, it is beyond doubt that the mysteries of the pagans, as a pagan religion, would not suffer by comparison with the moral tone of Christian behavior, both in the early days and since. Indeed, a decision of omnipotence, that is, judgment, would almost certainly give the mysteries a wit, the better in the wit in the wit, the better in the verdict. The statement must not be taken as a snap throw of biased conjecture. It is only too well grounded on a mass of data in Christian history, lying close at hand, which there is no room to present here. Since then, the mysteries propagated the science of spiritual development and incorporated all the motions of the mystical experience of the soul's attunement to divine nature in myths, allegories, symbols, and dramatic representation. Mysteries can be considered to have been the originated source and propagators of the mythical science. It is clearly evident has been seen by a few of the more astute of the Christian scholars that the sacred writings done in myth and allegory were just the ultimate transcriptions of the oral ritual forms and locations from memory to paper. This at once accounts for the mythical and allegorical character of all this ancient language, and it is thus solves a problem which has taxed the brains of generations of scholars to the breaking point. More than a few writers have seen and stated that the body of the myths was a literal deposit from the rituals of the ancient festival celebrations. The myths came to be produced and finally precipitated into writing as a kind of gloss on the dramatization in the mystery rites. Space forbids our citing the authorities that would corroborate this pronouncement. Thus, it happened that the early literate productions of nearly all races fall into the mythical form, as Higgins has so strongly asserted. Therefore, it is not surprising to hear another writer on ancient things, that is Zenonite A. Ragozin, Ragozin, in his story called The Story of Chaldean, page 299, says, quote, a race that has no national epods is one devoid of great memories, incapable of high cultural and political development, and no such has taken a place among the leading races of the world. All those that have occupied such a place at any time in the world's history have had their mythical and heroical ages, brimful of wonders and fanciful creations, end quote. And he supplements this with the fine observations that in page 297, quote, this is the tradition of every ancient nation. There is a vast and misty track of time between the unpierceable gloom of an eternal past and the broad daylight of recorded history. There are, is shadowly, gigantic, superhuman. These gods move down yet visible, shrouded in a golden a cloud of mystery and awe. There by their side loom other shapes as dim but more familiar, humans yet more than human, the heroes, the fathers of races, founders of nations, the companions, the beloved of gods and goddesses, nay, their own children, mortals themselves, yet doing deeds of daring and might such as only the immortals could inspire and favor. The connecting link between these and ordinary humanity, as that gloomy and uncertain shifting, but not altogether unreal streak of time in the borderland between heaven and earth, the very hotbed of myth, fiction, and romance, end quote. This marginal area between heaven and earth for the mortal races is comparable to the childhood period of humanity, before methodological plotting written records of happenings is kept, and when, of course, the imagination glows with the idealistic coloring which suffices the consciousness in childhood, but that which the period has handed on a written record of life need not be a base and misty track of time to intelligent interpretations of the myths, and is so only because of the Iran stoic of the modern mind, which closes itself off from all possible chance to read the myths aright. Lundy, Lundy, in his Monumental Christianity, page 178, comes to grips with this question of the status and meaning of the myths in very cogent matter. Quote, if the mythos has no spiritual meaning, then all religions become mere idolatry or the worship of material things. But we have seen the symbols of Oriental pagan religions, which indicate a supreme power and intelligence above matter, and also how early Christianity abhorred idolatry. Apollo as a mythical type and the Good Shepherd as a reality then must mean something more than mere material light and guidance, end quote. If Higgins is correct in saying that, that mythology has corrupted all history, it will be necessary to give more heed to the statement made by Alan Udward in his book called Divine Mystery, in page 215, where he says, quote, on the surface, the Israelites' legend is an attempt to find in the national history the illustration of what we call Zoroastrianism theology, end quote. This broad statement would demand a small volume to substantiate it in its essential truth, but it is an item of the lost understanding attested by a mountain of data from many sources. Not only did the Hebrew people attempt to structuralize their past history to fit the model dramatization of the theological systemology, but many another nation did the same thing. No work of ancient study so clearly and convincingly set forth this operation as the Anticalipsis of Godfrey Higgins, cited herein. To the end, the formations, to this end, the formulators of the religion of each nation, of every nation, work to react their objective history and their national geography into the form and nomenclature of the models provided by the mythos, and most strangely of all the astrological mythos. Place names and historical events were contoured into the nomenclature and type graphs of spiritual experience in the mythos, first placed in the constellation of the heavens and later transferred to earth and interwoven into the geography and history of one nation after another. The Anticalipsis presents over 800 pages in substantiation of this general assertion. General Macy indeed states that the chart of Judea looks like a copy of the scenery in Amenta, Amenta, the Egyptian underworld or place of dead souls. Actually, our earth itself as it would be if the land had been originated mapped out by the immigrants from Egypt. Amenta and the Arab paradise, with its heavens on the summit of the mount, have been repeated at innumerable sacred places in the world. End quote. Massey is emphatic in claiming the astrological origins of indeed all religions, says he in The Logic of the Land, Logia, page 4. Quote, astrologically, every religion drama the world over may be traced to and is located in the zodiac signs of the sun, end quote. And Trenchery, he carries this to the Gospels, as to which he says, quote, the truth is that the earliest Gospels are farthest removed from supposedly human history. They came last, and only when the spiritual Christ of the Gnosis had been rendered concrete in the density of Christian ignorance, end quote. That the sacred scriptures of the ancient day were in that time taken allegorically and not historical is well attested by one fact alone of nearly decisive weight. And speaking of the Essenes and the pagan Sibyls, that is Higgins, page 576 says, quote, almost every particular in the life of Christ, as detailed in the Gospels, is to be found in the Siblings, so that it can scarcely be doubted that the Siblings were copied from the Gospel history, or the Gospel history from them. It is also very certain that there was a Aratharian Sibyl before the time of Christ, end quote. The evidence that the copying must have been done with the Gospels were being put in written form. The Sibyls were undoubtedly first, previously done, not copied later. The Encyclopedia Britannica, that is the article called Jews, says that the various traditions up to this stage cannot be regarded as objective history. That was a quote. Yet it goes on to say that these narrations cannot be treated from any modern standpoint as fiction. If a thing is neither history nor fiction, what one must ask, can it be? To this pretended query, only esoteric holds the answer. Nowhere else can it be found. The only literate production that is neither history nor fiction is allegory and mixed myth. It is true that it is not. It is true that it is not, or not yet, historicized. It is truth in the ideal, the abstract, the eternal possibility of actualization. Pliny, Pliny, referring to the Essenes, remarked, quote, the Essenes have already existed several thousand years, and one of the best ascertained facts concerning this sect is that they possess secret holy writings of their own, which they guarded with special care, end quote. Again, the Encyclopedia Britannica, in the article called Midrash, Midrash, says that, quote, the tendency to reshape history for the edification of later generations was no novelty when Chronicles was written about the 4th century BC. Pragmatic historiography is exemplified in the earliest continuous source, end quote. Midrash was just this tendency to see romantic sense in the narrative in the old written traditions the article emphasizes. Quote, The rigid line between fact and fiction in religious literature, which readers often wish to draw, cannot be consistently justified, and in studying old Oriental religious narratives, it is necessary to realize that the teachings was regarded as more essential than the method of presenting it. Midrash, which may be called useless for historical investigations, may be apprehended for the light it throws upon forms of thought. Historical criticism does not touch the reality of the ideas, and since they may be a worthy or study of the apparent facts they clothe, they thus indirectly contribute to history. In any case, while the true historian kernel of the Midrashian narrative will always be a matter of dispute, the teachings to which it is applied stands on its independent footing, as also does the application of that teaching to other ages. End quote. The discussion in the encyclopedia is a truth that needs constant re-emphasizing among moderns. It cannot be taken otherwise than the article is trying with a bit of circumlocution to say that the Midrashian literature of the Jews is spiritual allegory masked in the guise of Hebrew history, useless for historical investigation, and this should be driven home to all students. It still conveys a profound message that concerns and eliminates all history. But it is silly to say that the teaching was regarded as more essential than the method of presenting it. Where, except perhaps in poetry, is this not the case? It makes a flourish over a point where no point is in question. Yet the observations made are of great moment because their important findings have been made crucially significant by their neglect and floundering. Among those who have joined in the course of founding the allegory methods is a figure no less eminent than Canon Canon Farrell, Farrar, who is in the Lives of the Fathers, page 384, says, quote, but when we clearly scan the somewhat vague and mysterious references of Clement, his tradition seems to be ultimately nothing more than an application to scriptures of the allegorical method which he received from Panias, as Panias had probably learned it from the writings of Philo, and as Philo and his teachers had borrowed it from the Stoic method of interpreting Homer. So far as we may judge from Clement himself, the method was absolutely valueless. He did not even furnish any criterion by which he could draw a deep line of distinction between the scriptures and apocryphal writings. And when he came to apply it practically, the result to which it led him were unattainable and even absurd. Clement's Gnostics was supposed to be able to interpret scripture in a higher, more spiritual way than the ordinary believer. These were the common of all Christians, but the illuminated of Orthodox Gnosticism were supposed to read it in them, meaning undiscernible to the vulgar eye. In point of fact, the allegorical evolution of so-called spiritual interpretation was so far from being a valuable method that it became the favorable camping grounds of all heresies or heretics, and the least acceptable bulwark of their manifold aberrations. End quote. This lengthy passage is introduced because it so frankly presents the element to be dealt with in this session, and becomes furnished perhaps the most glaring example of that horrifying stupidity that caused generation after generation of Christian scholarship to gaze upon the body of ancient allegorical depreciation of truth and never once rest a single ray of comprehension of what might value lay in mass before them. Every single assertion of Farrell misses the point by miles and becomes a downright untruth. The result of handling of the allegory by Clement and even the more learned Origen were admittedly not what they might have been in more competent hands. Nevertheless, the allegories of the Bible and allegories they are, from Adam and the tree and serpent to Jonah and the big fish, were only untenable and absurd, because even Clement lacked the technical skill properly to bring out the abstruse cryptid sense. The interpretation of the allegory by rash champions and expositories has often been little short of horrendous in its miscarriage of true sense. more must be said about this presently. To show that in the Christian understanding of the origins of their own religion, there is by no means certified knowledge of vital points. It will be well to follow Farrar's arraignment of Clement's Allegorion with another eminent Christian historian view of the most famous and most widely discussed allegories of Clement, very distinctly pupil and successor of the great and learned Origen. Origen allegories have ever been a thorn in the flesh of Orthodox exegesis and theological history, where his deep learning commands the respect, while it at the same time baffles the exegetic ingenuity of all the theologians. The situation has left them not plus and defeated, reluctant to condemn perhaps the greatest originator of biblical analysis restrains them from too severe opprobrium of his work. So the tack is always to praise cautiously and with reservation, or to censor mildly and with commentary or side remarks to straddle the issue and save Christian faith. But on the whole, while it still falls, or is far short of seeing and resting the truth of the matter, von Mosheim treatise on Origen's allegories is far fairer than most others. In his great history, he writes in volume 2, page 167, quote, certainly he would have had no enemies if he had merely affirmed what no one then called in question, that in addition to the sense which the words of Scripture convey, another sense laden in the things described is to be diligently sought for. This will be manifest if we consider who were the men that inveighed so bitterly against Origen's allegories after he was dead. I refer to Eustathius, Athanasius, Jerome, Augustine, and many others. All these were themselves allegorious, if I may use that term, and would undoubtedly have condemned any man as a great heiress who would have dared to impugn the arcane sense of Scripture, or to censor the deriving both doctrines and precepts and knowledge of future events from the narratives and laws contained in the Bible. There must therefore have been something new and unusual in Origen's exegetics, which appeared to them pernicious and very dangerous. Otherwise, they would have regarded his system of interpretation as beautifully and perfectly correct. End quote. It is thrilling to have the historian thus set the stage for the revelation of this extra something that Origen insisted on in the Bible reading, but which the Orthodox fathers could or dared not accept, and well can be understood now why they dare not go along with their too deeply or occulted discerning fellow exegesis. To accept and endorse his mode of interpreting Holy Writ would have written the death warrant of their world-conquering Christendom. For his method would have read out all the history in the Scriptures and read in nothing but the spiritual sense. So says Mosheim, volume 2, pages 168. Quote, the first and chief was that he pronounced a great part of the sacred books to be void of meaning if taken literally, and that only the things indicated by the words were the signs and emblems of higher objects. He turned much of the sacred history into moral fables, and no small part of the divine precepts into the mere allegories. End quote. What a picture this presents. Here was the most intelligent of all those fathers of the Christian faith standing for what he knew to be the true character and high spiritual purport of the archaic scriptures that his church had taken up from ancient pagan sources and had adopted and put forth as the literal vehicles of their sacred tenets. From his teachings at the hand of Clement, who received it from Antonius, and he, in common with all the Alexandrian schools, from the chief ancient purveyor of it all, Philo Judaeus, he was fully conversant with the tradition of literal esotericism that prevailed all the ancient world, in the light of which the Scriptures were to be translated, never according to the letter of the words, but in a mystical spiritual reverence, by which a far profounder and entirely sublime anthropological cosmic meaning could be caught by a mind instructed in the proper matter of detecting such underlying significance. Origen let it be repeated well and surely knew this, and in the spirit of one true Christian, that is, seeking to develop all aspects of the science of the cultivation of the Christ in man, he aimed to strengthen the growing moment with which he had allied himself with the true and only probable, indeed only possible, distinctive method of deriving spiritual light and substance from the selected scriptures of his church. Not only did Origen know that this semi-secret methodology in biblical science, but there is no doubt that the other intelligent leaders of the movement were as well acquainted with it as he. There are many proofs of this, the foremost being that most of his associates follow him, including Ambrose and even Jerome, until the latter was, or so to say, jerked up short in his tendencies to do so by the embittered outcries of the ignorant majority leadership, who had by now been completely dominated by the wholly literal and historical thesis of interpretation. Naturally, not too many follow Origen, at any rate, not enough to give his method any general acceptance. The esoteric method tends ever to be a prized possession of a limited few, but all those in the tradition of esotericism understood in the critic Origen's style of approach to Bible meaning. It was critic epoch for Christianity. It stood on the crossroads. If it could have risen to the high point of appreciation and acceptance of Origen's allegories, the fate of Christian of the world would have been determined for all time to work out to a more elevated culture than the one historically instead. But the decision would have enabled it to meet every contingent of future history with a vastly greater power of discriminating intelligence than ever to be to this day has commanded in the ranks of either its laity or its clerical hierarchy. But alas, the Acumen needed to see the sound basis and the actual rightness of Origen's position had already been extinguished, and he was left at the last true Christian exegeticus, bleeding plainly in the wilderness of plebeian ignorance, hoping that his voice might still be heard by enough to hold the inner citadel of a spiritual understanding of the sacred books of soul science. But again, at last, he was doomed to disappointment, and with the suppression of his voice and his influence, the last hope of saving true Christianity from a swift and final descent into the mires and quicksands of an impossible and ruinous literalism and historization of its holy scriptures was swept away. Origen went down into repudiation and rejection among his own brethren, so that he was hardly dead until it was a foremost accusation brought against others of the fathers, such as Jerome, that they had let Origen's teachings and predominantly his allegories influence their beliefs and teachings. And within 300 years of his death, the Second Council of Constantinople antinomized, let's get this right here, antinomized him and threatened verse and excommunication anyone found owning or reading his writings. That's correct, folks. It's just not him. There's others. They began to anyone that began to they would go back in the past and start speaking out against others. And they'll say, well, it's almost as though as I see it here, basically people come along later on and say, if you have these writings, you're a reprobate. You're not a Christian. You see, when in reality they were not the Christians. You see, they were not the true Christians. Let's see where we're at here. His great work of comparative texts, the Hexapla, was destroyed. Origen held out to the new movement the chance to redeem itself from its early tendencies to reject the esoteric doctrine in favor of a bare historical literalism. But once more, at last, the insight to decry the true advantage and justness of this course had been blinded by pietism, zeal, and sheer ignorance, and the chance to save Christianity for truth and sanity was gone for at least 1,600 years. Paul's messages and contributions tended to restore the religion to true, positive, and a little later, Dionysius, the Areopagite, strove to reintroduce the deeper spiritual modes of apprehension, and several centuries later, another outstanding figure arose in a bleak epoch of Christian history to redeem the movement from its smothering by literalism in the person of Scotus, Scotus, Erogenia. Both wished to eradicate Christianity with the restored light of the Platonic philosophy. In their cases and some others, the light of true meaning of the theology flared out in a limited circle of esoteric cultists, but of course never reached the masses with any effective impact. A blanket of intelligent Stoic settled down over the world of Christian with the defeat of Origen, and there it had laid ever since. Not only has the priesthood done nothing to lift it, but indeed it had designated, cultivated, and perpetuated it. And we have the odd but tragic spectacle of Origen's own church in the person of such a learned scholar as von Mosheim, not to say many others, holding up to ridicule the authoritarian claim of a man like Origen that their scriptures held a higher, more mystical meaning that would be apparent to the mind of a lout or a simpleton. Origen was striving to uphold the method of interpretation by which they could glorify their own scriptures with a meaning far more edifying than the simple literal narrative. Christianity stood at the parting roads of its destiny, the one with the signboard marked to literal degradation, quote, or to another quote, to darkness, end quote, another quote, to bigotry, end quote, to another quote, to persecution, end quote, and quote, to murder, and another quote, to spiritual insight, to refined culture, to humanitarianism, and to intelligent understanding, end quote. And it shows fatally the one to the left. Christianity rejected the true spiritual meaning of the scriptures, even when offered to it by its most learned father. But man, singly or collectively, must pay for his choices, ignorantly or intelligently made. And for 1,600 years, this religion has been meeting the evil consequences of this choice against Origen. A religion which has never ceased to claim that it is the highest spiritual system in world history, definitely rejected the highest spiritual in favor of a ludious and debasing literal interpretation of ancient books of supernatural wisdom. And 5/6 of all its theological efforts ever since has a consequence had to be devoted to the impossible, hopeless task of reconciling the crudities and inconsistencies of a literal historical rendering of books that were clearly only allegorical with the demands of fact, of logic, and of common sense. This is the appropriate place at which to register a vigorous protest against the use by Christian writers of one single little word which they have no studious let creep into their denotation of the allegorical method. Times without number one finds them declaring the method ineligible and a failure for the reason that it reduced the level to mere allegory. Or they avert, that is, left the Bible, quote, nothing but, then allegory, end quote. I'll say it again. That is, quote, nothing but, end quote, allegory, or, quote, only, end quote, allegory. To one who has enlightened his mind with the understanding of the full dynamic power of allegory and the knowledge of its absolutely indisputable utility in bringing out the one true and exalted meaning of the scriptures to the displacement of the tawdry, that is, outcome of the literal historical rendering, the word mere, as a fit adjective companion of, quote, allegory, becomes the spur to a quite justifiable exasperation. Not only does it reflect all too clearly the crass ignorance that has dealt, so unjustly with the most elevated mode of human edification, floundering the everlasting appeal of poetry and symbolism, but it testifies also in a most repugnant way to the cheap trickery of a false insinuation to damn a noble thing with a slimy slur. It deserves the sharpest reprobation. Next section. For it casts on allegory a totally untrue and unmerited slander. One has no more right to speak of allegory as mere allegory than to speak of poetry as mere poetry, or beauty as mere beauty, or a picture as a mere picture. After all, a thing is entitled to the right to be called whatever it is without slur or stigma. It is what it is, or it is something else. The writers resort to calling the esoteric Bible means, quote, mere allegory, end quote. So then what they would do is simply put Bible meaning here, what I'm saying is mere, meaning quote, and then end quote would be mere, and then what would have allegory. So what they're saying is they're cheapening it, you see. They're making fun of it. Is their disingenuous way of advertising their contention that it is not allegory at all, but real history. Yeah, real history, all right. Yeah, the whole world is blind to this, especially the West. Indeed, that's my take on this. Many with origin have claimed with strong foundation that it is not history at all, but allegory. So the mere, that is the quote, end quote, must go in to discredit the claim. It has no right there whatever. Either the Bible is allegory or it's not. And if, as it indeed the case, it is allegory, or was originally so, then allegory it is, and not mere allegory. You see, to besmirch allegory with the only or the mere is to discredit a noble thing. It's like saying simply someone's mere beautiful. I mean, it's like, what do you mean mere beautiful? Oh well, it's not. Well, it's not quite beautiful. You see, this is the way to discredit it. Anyway, the transcendental utilitarian thing allegory truly is had real knowledge of the grandeur of allegory continued in the Christian church. Its spokesman could have kept saying for centuries that the Bible is a work of beauteous and splendid allegory, and thus saved themselves the chagrin and opium opprobrium that must now descend upon them when it is recognized at last that these scriptures, not so falsely read or as factual history, are in solid truth the sublimities of allegories and hundredfold more illuminating as such. The way is clear, then, to meet and refute another claim of the church apologists that has been put forward again and again to execute their failure to discern the true servicelessness of Orion's allegories. One writer after another has vented the allegation that Orion's method was perhaps attaining some measure of success in the most spiritual illumination of Bible texts, in the main ran out in the extravagance of untenable, strained, unnatural, and often clearly ridiculous meanings. To these critics, it seemed no doubt honestly conclusive that the allegory method swept away all solid substance and reality from the text and left only a thin gossamer tissue of metaphor and mystical faith. It swept away too the one central keystone of the whole Christian edifice, the historical reality of Jesus, although Origen does not seem to have carried his thesis so far as to reject, except possibly by implacable logical inference, the actual existence of Jesus, or to reduce him, as Smith, Drews, Robertson, Dupuis, and Tübingen school in Germany undertook to do, to the status of a mythical personification. Yeah, Tübingen University is in Germany. When Origen had done his best to lift the scriptures into the lofty atmosphere of a spiritual sense, that atmosphere proved to the critics and to the laity then and since to be too rare and then thin a substance to support the strength of robust piety and wholehearted devotion. It seemed to release the meaning, not only the solid ground of earthly reality, but in the misty clouds a simmering vapors of mere sentimentality and dreamy unreality. It dissolved the Christian rock of Holy Writ into atomic dust of mere metaphor. In revulsion from the unsubstantiated and hollow pagan mysticism and the shallow sense of symbols, the new Christian faith that was to carry the hopes and pietism yearning of the lower masses was destined by the necessities of the case to throw out in grand impatience these glittering appetons that culture professed to toy with and demand the staunch realism of a historical factuality to stand upon and abide by. And so it was, indeed. And hence the time is right to utter the words that will put into true light for the first time the reason why, even when advocated and supported and with his best endeavor utilized by the most learned of the church fathers, Origen, the true key to the scriptures, totally failed to win recognition and adoption by the Christian movement. Others have essayed to render the scriptures according to the allegorical method and with the keys it provided. Let it be acknowledged here frankly that the method has never, so far as the present writer is aware, achieved a measure of success that it all proved its merit or its possibilities. It is here and now asserted that this failure does not prove the inadequacy of the or the potentiality of the method, but does prove the incompetence of those endeavoring to employ it. This explanation has never been offered before, and the whole Christian academic world will shout to controvert it. Nevertheless, the assertion now has solid grounds of evidence to stand upon that is lacked in all the centuries until the present. It has to be admitted also in the light of a far more perfect insight into the subtleties and profound intimations of the marvelous ancient language of symbolism and that Origen, which sufficiently astute in catching some portions of the true spiritual sense of the old tombs of wisdom, still was far from qualifying as an adept and sure interpreter in this field. It is clear enough that if the redactor is not equipped with a practical, perfect knowledge of this great symbolic and analogical science, his effort is bound to run out in gross misreading and omit some partial true rendition. This is this this it is now seen is the case with Clement and Origen. Much chaff remains clinging to the golden wheat of their sifting. He did not succeed by more than a meager percentage. He was on the right track, but stumbled along and did not ever reach the final goal of full esoteric meaning. It is true that the Orthodox charge that if the claims of the allegory method rest on Origen's real accomplishment in this providence, or that of many others since, the method would lack vindication, but presents studenthood, building upon the great results and discoveries of the Rosetta Stone in 1796. The consequent translation of the religious literature of Old Egypt, the epipod analysis of this revealing material by Massey and Higgins, and the revival of the genuine theosophical philosophies of the Ophria and Hermetic, the Pythagorean school, the Platonic and Neoplatonic system of archaic wisdom, promises soon the cultivation of an interpretive competence that will redeem the Holy Scripture from their absurd sense as objective histories to the full glory of their inevitable transcendence of meaning as spiritual allegories. With the perfection of this new-found but age-old science of symbolism, variable a new era in religion is dawning for the world. The wisdom sorely needed to solve distressing world problems awaits the consummation of adaptation in this mightiest of science. The inveterate recalcitration of the Orthodox scholastic mind to the obvious realities underlying and making necessity the allegory methods of interpretation is difficult to understand. Byron, in his Lives of the Fathers, volume 2, 443, says that the key to Origen's allegory method of interpretation was not the right one, and the text was entirely contorted from its original sense, but it took the world 1,000 years more to learn the true principles of exegesis. Barrow had not deigned to tell us when these true principles of exegesis were regained, who recaptured them, and how religious books have been re-illuminated by the new flood of light that their application would release. In spite of to indulge in higher criticism, the method of exegesis is still the literal historical one, although one notices that Orthodox interpreters of Scripture at places where the context renders what Warshammer calls the plain meaning, obviously absurd, are forced to declare it to be allegory. They have no hesitation in declaring the text material to be allegorical when it suits their purpose and no other resort is possible. This is manifestly disingenuous. Likewise, Fisher reference to the Greek myths in another place is too intriguing to be passed by. He says it is natural to ask how the Greeks could have ever given credits to the myths, some of which attributed gross immortality to the gods, while continuing to venerate these unprincipled deities. How can men adore as just and good beings to whom they imputed deeds of treachery, lust, and cruelty? He suggests that men could have supposed the gods to be privileged to indulge licentiously whims in a realm of divine freedom above the laws that bound lowly humans. He's even generous enough to think that it was not a quote, not an impure fancy chiefly, but circumstances attending the growth of mythology in the form in which it was cast by the poets had led to the creation of these offensive stories, end quote. But we in turn find it natural to ask Fisher, how can he now give credence to a fairly long list of equally offensive stories exhibiting treachery, lust, and cruelty, not to say gross sexuality, printed in his own biblical Old Testament? It is too much to expect that men like Fisher can ever be brought to understand that no intelligent Greek ever believed these myths. They had sense enough to know that the myths were not made to be believed. Belief was not asked. What was asked was understanding, grasp of a subtle recondile and splendid meaning obscurely hinted at in the form and structure of the fabrication. None but the grossly ignorant and stupid in Greece could ever have believed those myths. And it is not spleen, but simple truth to assert now that only the ignorant and unimaginable really believe the narratives assembled in the Old Testament. But tragically enough, there came a time when high intelligence in Greece failed, and all but the few philosophers and initiates in the mysteries did believe these stories. And it is the purpose of this book to show that the blight of intelligence swept on until it deadened the minds of Hebrews and Christians to the point where they came to believe the myths that composed their own scriptures. And with that came the Dark Ages. Referring to Apollinaris, Varro states that, quote, this teacher seems to have confirmed Jerome in the allegorical method of explaining scripture, end quote. In a work on Philo, page 33, the author Norman Bentwich says that the Jews also study philosophy and have begun to talk in technical catchwords, then to reinterpret their scriptures according to the ideas of philosophy. This will be done by any group that holds long enough to the pursuit of philosophy of the ancient world to begin to see that the true and correct, at any rate, meaningful interpretation of scriptures can be made with no other keys. Midwich follows this on the next page with a final analysis of the ancient situation that made esotericism an indispensable usage. Nowadays, he says, the Bible is the holy book of so much of the civilized world that it is somewhat difficult for us to form a proper conception of what it was to the civilized world before Christian era. We have to imagine a state of culture in which it was only the book of books of one small nation, while to others it was at best a curious record of ancient times. Just as the Code of Hammurabi, or the Egyptian Book of Life is to us, the Alexandrian Jews were the first to popularize its teachings to bring Jewish religion into line with that of the Greek world. It was to this end that they founded a particular form of midrash, the allegorical interpretation, which largely a distinctive product of the Alexandrian age. The Palestinian rabbis at the time were, on the one hand, developing by dialectic discussion the oral tradition into a vast system of religious, ritual, and legal jurisprudence. On the other, weaving around the law by way of adornment to it, and a variegated fabric of philosophy, fabric, sorry, fabric of philosophy, fable, allegory, and legends. Simultaneously, the Alexandrian preachers, they were never quite the same as the rabbis were, emphasizing for the outer world as well as for their own people, the spiritual side of the religion, elaborating a theology that should satisfy the reason and seeking to establish the harmony of Greek philosophy with Jewish monotheism and the Mosaic legislation. Allegorical interpretation is based upon the supposition or fiction that the author who is interpreted intended something other that than what is expressed. It is the method used to read through, it is the method used to read thought into a text, which is words do not literally bear by attaching to each phrase some deeper, usually some philosophical meaning. It enables the interpreter to bring writings of antiquity into touch with the culture of his own or any other age. The gates of allegory are never closed, and they open upon a path which stretches without a break through the centuries. This picture drawn by Benwick has the merit of being accurately delineated. Again and again in the course of history, groups of students and thinkers breaking through the prison bars of heavy orthodoxy to discover the light of reveling in their intoxication wisdom embodied in the archaic philosophy of the past have formed centers to cultivate and republish the golden knowledge of old. The school of Pythagoras and Plato were such centers, but the one that shone brightly for a long period was that which flourished at Alexandria. Here, intelligence was keen enough and learning profound enough to hold the level of study and understanding at a high pitch. Here, then, was the birthplace of much of the archaic literature that strove to perpetuate and transmit the esoteric wisdom in its allegorical dress. Here, let's see where was that. Here, then, was the birthplace of much of the archaic literature that strove to perpetuate and transmit esoteric wisdom in an allegory dress. Here were the great brotherhoods of mystical cultism with their academia and libraries. Here the pursuit of a wisdom and that knew no bounds of national character, but was truly Catholic and ecumenical, served as a bond to unite Jew and Greek and Arabic and Chaldean in the fraternity of a true unifying depth of understanding. It was a center where, in the interest of a knowledge that transcended all earthly demarcations, all men of deep penetration could find a brotherhood of the spirit. But for the infusion into it of elements of philosophical lore emanating from Alexandria, the young Christian movement would not have survived the 3rd century. Fisher lends corroboration to this general assertion when he says, quote, it was at Alexandria, under the peculiar influence that belonged to that great meeting place of the nations, that Jewish thought underwent the most serious modification. Of those modifications, end quote, modifications. Of those modifications, Christianity was short to receive the effect. Here, Philo formulated his system, which is Fisher's words, quote, was an amalgamation of Greek philosophy with the Old Testament theology, a combination of Plato and Moses, the tenets of which he considered to be in many points identical. The Greek sages he held were borrowers from the Hebrew teachings, the interpretations he effected by the flexible method of allegory, his theory being that of occult sense, open and discerning, underlying the literal and historical meaning of the scriptures, and is to be accepted with it, end quote. Pantanius, Clement, and Origen labored and perfected their product in the same Alexandria. Is there need to ask why they strove to engraft onto the budding Christian movement the branch of learning that would ensure to this movement at least the deeper and saner interpretation of the Holy Scriptures? Massey brings to our attention a point of keen discernment in this connection. He notes Origen's observation that it is the law of Moses had contained nothing which was to be introduced as having a secret meaning, the prophet would not have said, "Open thy my eyes, and I will behold wondrous things out of the law." That's based upon Psalms 119, verses 18. Whereas he knew that there was a veil of ignorance lying upon the heart of those who read and do not understand the figurative meaning. And he tells Celsius that the Egyptians veiled their knowledge of things in fabric and allegory. Quote, "The learned may penetrate into the significance of all Oriental mysteries, but the vulgar can only see the exterior symbol. It is allowed by all who have any knowledge of the scriptures that everything is conveyed enigmatically." End quote. And I'm going to end that right now. We haven't finished the complete chapter, but we'll do that another time. So I wanted to share this information that is from the reading today of the book by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, which is called The Shadow of the Third Century. And this section is chapter 5, calling Wisdom in a Mystery. So thank you for being here. Hope that you enjoy it. A little over an hour today, that is. And we will continue to read from this particular book. And we'll talk to you then. Okay? Thank you for being here. You take care.